But yeah, so this whole book feels like wish fulfillment and fantasy on a variety of levels. Which again, when you hear about V.C. Andrews' own life, it makes sense. Hello and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews, published in 1979. And I will be talking about both adaptations. So we have the 1987 adaptation directed by Jeffrey Bloom, and then the 2014 adaptation directed by Deborah Chow. And this has been requested a number of times. However, I have always dismissed it because this book is infamous for the fact that it has a romance between a brother and a sister, and that grosses me out. So I never had any interest whatsoever in reading this book. However, it had been mentioned enough times that I entertained the idea of covering it when I put it in a book versus movie poll, which it won. So I am here today talking about this book. And Flowers in the Attic is fiction. I saw multiple people online being like, oh, I can't believe this is based on a true story. And oh, I can't believe this really happened. But no, this did not really happen. I will be talking about V.C. Andrews because there are things about her past that are relevant to the book Flowers in the Attic. But this book is fiction. Don't let anybody try to tell you otherwise. But yeah, I will be talking about her as well in part of this video. And I also want to start out this video by saying that I had a hard time taking this book seriously. And while I liked it, I see it as being an entertaining pulp novel, basically, almost akin to a soap opera. And it talks about things that should be upsetting to read about, and yet it seems like the author is trying to write about it in a way that is so exciting and titillating. And I did start the second book because I liked this one enough and I was curious enough to see what happens. But the second book was even more extreme in this way. And the fact that it felt like a soap opera because everything was so melodramatic and ridiculous. And again, it was talking about things that are wrong and should be upsetting. And yet it was written about as if it was supposed to be exciting and thrilling. And yeah, afterwards I read the synopsis because I DNF'd the book. And so I read to see what happened. And the plot is just a mess, honestly, based on what I saw. So yeah, I feel like these books, Flowers in the Attic, started out very soap opera-esque and melodramatic and something that I had a hard time taking seriously. And it seems like she just continued and pushed it even more as the books went on. But this is coming from someone who only started the second book and didn't finish it. So if you have read the entire series, comment down below sharing your thoughts. But basically, I am saying this because now, if you are someone who does take this book seriously, and if you really like it, and if you were impacted by the story, now you know how I viewed it and what this video will be like, and you can determine if this is a video you even want to watch. And if you disagree so wholeheartedly with the fact that it all came across so melodramatic and silly, then yeah, maybe this video isn't for you. Granted, I did like the book, so that I do have some positive things to say, but yeah, I also just, again, it came across very pulpy in many ways. But from here on out, I will now be getting into the details of the plot, which means there will be spoilers going forward. And the 2014 movie follows the book pretty closely, so I'm going to talk about those two together first. And then at the end, I will talk about the 80s film because that one actually makes a lot of changes to the story, so I will talk about that in its own section. So we start off in both book and movie seeing the Dollenganger family, which consists of Corinne, the mother, Chris, the husband, the oldest son, also named Chris, the daughter Cathy, and they have two young twins, Carrie and Corey. And they have an idyllic life until the father dies in a car accident. And Corinne feels she has no real skills to keep the family afloat. Also, this is in the 1950s, by the way. And she and her husband were in so much debt and don't truly own anything they have. And so she tells Chris and Cathy that she has incredibly filthy rich parents, and she has written to them and they have agreed that they can come stay in their home. And Chris and Cathy had never even heard about Corinne's parents. And so Corinne, she reveals to them over time that when she was 18, she married her half uncle, so her father's half brother. So even though it was her father's half brother, he was only just a few years older than Corinne. But they fell in love, and so they got married, and her parents are super strict, devoutly religious, and so they were so disgusted by this marriage that they disowned her, removed her from the will, and, kicked her out. By the way, you don't need to be devoutly religious to find incest disgusting. But anyway, now that Chris has died, they are welcoming Corinne back. However, her father is under the impression that Corinne never had any children, and that is the only reason he is letting her back. Her mother, on the other hand, is a severe, cruel woman, but she knows about the children's existence, and she has made arrangements to hide them in the attic until her husband can be made aware of them. And Corinne tells the kids initially, like, oh, you won't have to be in here long. Like, I'm going to win back my father, and then I'll introduce him to you guys, and we'll be back in the will, and he's going to die soon because he's really sickly, and we'll be rich beyond our wildest imaginations. However, they of course end up being in the attic for far longer, and ultimately they are there for 3 years. And at the start of the book, when she has them living in the attic telling them this plan, I kept thinking, like, there had to be a better option. Like, this is really what she felt. She presented this like this was the only thing available, like this was the only option for them. And so I kept thinking, like, there had to be something else she could have done. She had to have some family friend or had to, like, be able to get a job or something. And then you kind of realize over time as you get to know Corinne that there definitely were other options. But Corinne ultimately is lazy and she enjoys a pampered life. And so there probably were other options, but she would have to be more poor and destitute. And so in her mind, she's like, the quickest way that I can get money and live well is to go back to my parents. And yeah, my kids will have to be in the attic, but that's okay. And so yeah, ultimately you realize it's just that she's lazy and selfish and likes nice things. And that is why she feels this is the best option. But in the movies, I was kind of getting the vibe that Corinne's father maybe sexually abused her, or maybe if he didn't do anything physical, like I got the vibe he was inappropriate with her in some way. And that is partly why her mother hated her and was jealous of how much her husband loved loved Corinne, who was just so beautiful. And in the book, we also hear, the father has a lot of heart issues. So that is what he is dying of. And Corinne's mother says how the first time he had a heart attack was when Corinne told them that she had married his half-brother. So yeah, he was so devoted to Corinne and loved her so much. And so he was so heartbroken. I'm using quotations because he seems like such a cruel, heartless man. And so can someone who's so heartless ever really be heartbroken? And again, I feel like he loved Corinne, but it seemed kind of weird and potentially inappropriate. Also in the book, it is said how Corinne's husband, Chris, looked so much like her father because, again, they are half siblings. And so that seems odd, too, that Corinne married and fell in love with someone who looked so much like her own father and who is even blood related to her own father. And so it seems like maybe there was something going on there, but let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Also, by the way, when you're commenting your thoughts down below, you might need to sort of, edit the words you use because sometimes YouTube will flag a comment as inappropriate and just like remove it or they hide it from me. So to have discussions about this book down below in a way that YouTube won't get rid of the comments, you might need to censor yourself a little bit. But in a similar vein, Cathy looks so much like Corinne, and Chris, her brother, looks so much like their father, Chris. And Cathy loved her father most, and Chris loved his mother most. And so when they start having a sexual undercurrent, there is that weird fact that they look like each other's favorite parent. And Cathy in the book, when they move to the grandparents' house into the attic, she is 12, whereas in the movie, she is clearly older than that. However, I don't think we are ever given her exact age in the movie. And then in both, Chris is like 3 years older than her. And they each take on a parent role to the young twins. And they are also in a confined space. They have the bedroom and bathroom. And then there's also the attic they can go into, which is huge. But, the attic gets crazy hot and crazy cold. And so their main living area is this small room. And so they inevitably see each other at times when they shouldn't. For example, in the movie, Chris walks in on Cathy when she is looking at herself in a bra, whereas in the book, he accidentally walks in when she is totally naked. And the grandma, so they see the grandma more than Corinne, really, because the grandma is there every day giving them food, and she'll also pop in at random times. And she keeps popping in, trying to catch them being inappropriate. But yeah, she is very stern, and she gives them a list of rules they have to follow. And some of the rules are things they can't do in order to prevent them from being, inappropriate with each other. But Chris and Cathy, especially Cathy, were so young when they moved into the attic that they had none of these ideas in their head at all. And so it seems like the grandma's paranoia about something like this happening is kind of what puts it in their head to begin with. And she's always calling them devil's spawn because they are the product of incest. And so, yeah, I feel like her always bringing this subject up and always accusing them of something is kind of what causes it to end up happening. Plus, also with their time in the attic, they have all of these raging hormones going on and are going through puberty, and they're not seeing other people. And so obviously, you have quite a cocktail of things going on. But in both, at one point, Cathy leaves the room to go steal money from her mother's bedroom. I'll get into this later. And she sees her mother's new husband sleeping in a chair. I will also talk about him more a bit later. But Cathy sneaks a kiss. And later, Chris is out of the room and overhears a conversation between his mom and this man. And Chris learns that this man had been partly awake. And the guy is talking to Corinne about dreaming about a beautiful young woman kissing him. And this is when Cathy is 15 and Chris is he's 17 or 18. And so when he comes back in the attic, he is furious at Cathy for the fact that she was so audacious enough as to kiss this man because, one, risking, their plans of escape, but two, he's also jealous that she kissed this guy. And he's like, do you think you're the only one who has these sexual feelings going on? And then from here in the movie, the 2014 movie, they then have consensual sex. And then the next morning, they are talking about their future. And Cathy says, we can pretend this never happened. But Chris says he doesn't want to pretend that, and he can never love another woman the way he loves her. And this is all the same in the book. He's mad at her for kissing the guy, and then he's, grabbing her, being like, you're mine, don't you see? You belong to me. And then from here in the book, he rapes her. So it is not consensual because she is trying to fight him off. But afterwards, he is so apologetic and feels so horrible. And he's like, I'll castrate myself before I ever do that again. But she tells him oh, don't worry, I forgive you, and I'm as much to blame as you are. And from here, we read, don't hate me, Cathy. Please don't hate me. I didn't mean to rape you. I swear to God. There's been so many times I have been tempted and I was able to turn it off. I'd leave the room, go into the bathroom or into the attic. I'd bury my nose in a book until I felt normal again. Tight as I could, I wrapped my arms around him. I don't hate you, Chris, I whispered, pressing my head tightly against his chest. You didn't rape me. I could have stopped you if I really wanted to. All I had to do was bring my knee up hard where you told me to. It was my fault too. Oh yes, my fault too. I should have known better than to kiss Mama's handsome young husband. I shouldn't have worn skimpy little see-through garments around a brother who had all a man's strong physical needs and a brother who was always so frustrated by everything and everyone. I had played upon his needs, testing my femininity, having my own burning yearnings for fulfillment. It was a peculiar kind of night, as if fate had planned this night long ago, and this night was our destiny, right or wrong. It was darkness lit up by the moon so full and bright, and the stars seemed to flash Morse code beams to one another. Fate accomplished. And from here, Cathy says, we can pretend like this never happened. And Chris assures her that because it's the first time, it won't lead to a pregnancy, which I have no idea where he's getting that logic from. But now I want to devote some time to this, romance of sorts between Chris and Cathy and how it's portrayed. Because on one hand, if this book was written better, we would see how twisted both have become due to being locked in this room, on top of the fact, again, that they have their grandmother calling them devil's spawn and always accusing them of being sexual, and it has gotten in their heads so much, plus the abuse and lack of seeing other people. It makes sense that this would happen. And it also makes sense that it would happen in such a violent way. And it makes sense that Cathy would be screwed up in the head enough due to her environment that she would blame herself after. Plus, this was the 50s, which wasn't exactly an empowering time for women. And also, even in today's day and age, when someone is sexually assaulted in this way, oftentimes the victim is the first one to victim blame, right? And that is why so often people don't come forward about this, is because they're thinking of all the ways in which they are to blame. And so, yeah, whenever people act like, well, if this happened, why didn't they come forward right away? And it's like, because they were thinking of all the ways in which people would see that they were to blame for what happened, or they truly believe they are to blame for what happened. So anyway, basically, Cathy seeing it as being her fault Like if this was written in a better way, that would make total sense. However, it came across to me like the author truly thought that Cathy was in part to blame. And it feels like this is the message she is sending to young readers because, by the way, a lot of young teenagers read this book when it came out. And so young readers are taking this in thinking that, oh yeah, Cathy, she played her part and she shouldn't have done X, Y, and Z. And she's just as much to blame for the rape occurring. So it's almost encouraging victim blaming. And then also, I'm not a fan of this being written as if it was fate. Like, oh, like this was destiny. And so Chris couldn't help himself. It's not his fault. It was destiny that this were to happen. And so I do not like that either. And the way the author writes this, yeah, it just comes across so salacious. And it doesn't feel like she sees these two people as being depraved and, ruined from their 3 years in the attic. It just came across like a trashy depiction of abuse and finding love wherever you can get it. And we are constantly hearing about, how this is a forbidden romance, either the grandma telling them that this isn't allowed, or you have moments where like Chris and Cathy are wrestling or something, and then he'll kiss her and she's like, Chris, don't, it's forbidden. And so forbidden romance is something that's often seen as so thrilling and sexy. And so the fact that it is framed in this way just makes it seem trashy when really reading about something like this happening and this, with this abuse going on, it should be so upsetting and disturbing, and yet it is not. It feels so ridiculous and far-fetched that it's not as upsetting or disturbing as it should be, and then certain aspects of the sexual tension going on are written as if it's like, oh, so sexy and alluring in this forbidden romance. By the way, in the sequel, Cathy starts like having a sexual tension and starts a romance of sorts with a man when she is 15 and he is 40. And as time goes on, they are engaged to be married, which again is taboo and forbidden. But rather than writing this like the gross thing it is and the fact that this man is a pedophile, it is written like it is sexy and dangerous. And at this point, I want to talk about V.C. Andrews because she actually wrote this book when she was in her 50s and she herself was still a virgin. So she suffered a fall when she was 18 and this caused health issues with her back, and she spent a lot of her life being shut up because her mom didn't want people seeing her daughter who, was handicapped. And she wasn't literally locked away like the kids are in the book, but she did spend a lot of time indoors because her mother was ashamed of her. And I read that a doctor she would go see took a liking to her, and this doctor told her that he was locked in an attic with his siblings in order for his mother to receive an inheritance. And so she took this guy's story and then her own experience, because when she would be shut up indoors, she would often imagine herself as a princess in a fairy tale who's locked away. And so she took her own experience to some extent, along with this story by this man, and that is what became Flowers in the Attic. But yes, being locked in the attic so your mom can get an inheritance, that does seem like abuse. But as far as all of the physical abuse and the incest going on is something that V.C. Andrews just came up with. Also, by the way, before Flowers in the Attic, she had written other romance stories that involved incest. And so I don't know what caused her to be drawn to this topic. But again, I think it's because it's like the ultimate forbidden love. And because of that, she must have found it intriguing. But also the fact that she herself had never had any experience with intimacy. Yeah, I guess she just found this super exciting and was writing about something that she fully wasn't comprehending, which maybe that sounds condescending considering she was a grown woman when she wrote this. But given she lived such a sheltered life, literally and figuratively, and was so inexperienced, she really was just like making up stuff that she thought was exciting and crazy and something that would keep the readers interested in. And also it makes sense that she would write a rape scene in a way that isn't as upsetting. The scene was upsetting, but it makes sense that she would maybe romanticize it in a sense, because coming from someone who is naive and hasn't experienced sex, the thought of a man wanting a woman so badly that he just had to force himself on her may have come across as romantic, like the fact that he just couldn't hold back. And then also something that is unique to the book is Chris overhears a couple having sex, like a maid and the butler, and he's telling Cathy about it, and the maid had not tried to fight the guy off, like she was super into it. And Cathy is so surprised by this. She's like, wow, like she didn't struggle at all. And so maybe in Cathy's mind, which again, for women raised in a certain environment and a certain time and culture, any kind of sex was seen as bad and something you shouldn't enjoy and maybe something you should resist. And so again, I don't know that VC Andrews herself feels that way, but it does give us insight into Cathy, maybe making it seem like she would fight off any man who tried to be with her, potentially, if she thinks that's just how it should be done. Granted, she was also 15. But yeah, anyway, same goes for the man who is 25 years Cathy's senior, being into her when she was only 15. The thought of being that desirable can be a fantasy for girls who are too young to realize how disturbing and gross those men actually are. And also, by the way, the 40-year-old man who's into Cathy when she was only 15 is a doctor. And so given VC Andrews had so many interactions with doctors starting at when she was in her teens, 18, I think is when she fell. But I'm sure, she had fantasies of Cathy is beyond beautiful and every man thinks, is drawn to her. And so this seems like wish fulfillment on VC Andrews' part, right? Like, fantasizing, what if I was so beautiful that every man who saw me couldn't resist me, And so just feels like wish fulfillment. And honestly, even the abuse kind of has a wish fulfillment feel, or kind of wish fulfillment and fantasy, because people do fantasize about having horrible things happen to them, as weird as that sounds, but also part of the fantasy usually involves them getting away from it. And so spoilers that they do get away from it. But yeah, so this whole book feels like wish fulfillment and fantasy on a variety of levels. Which again, when you hear about VC Andrews' own life, it makes sense because that basically is what this is. And also, of course, no one knows what goes on behind closed doors, and I myself have not read the VC Andrews biography. But yeah, it seems like her mother didn't treat her well, right? First of all, just locking her away because she was in a wheelchair. And so we read that similar to the kids in the attic, she had tons of gifts and she had tons of things and she was able to cultivate her art, and yet she was being locked away by her mother. And it seems like her mother was probably, it seems like she's controlling, but also VC Andrews had medical needs, right? And so the mom was also maybe around for that reason. But yeah, it seems like maybe she had an odd relationship with her mother. And so again, this comes across almost as wish fulfillment fantasy because the kids get revenge on the mom, right? Not in this book, but eventually they do. And in this book, even if they don't get revenge on her, they do escape, right? So just being able to get out is the fantasy for VC Andrews, who was locked away for so much of her life and maybe controlled by her mom. Again, I'm kind of making a lot of assumptions here, but yeah, it does seem like maybe she didn't have a great relationship with her mom. But now I need to talk about Corinne, their mother. So I actually found Corinne and the grandmother to be the two most intriguing characters, and I actually feel like it was such a shame that this book focuses so much on Cathy and Chris, because they're almost the more boring pair. I wanted to hear more about Corinne and the grandmother. And in the book, Corinne, so she puts them up in the attic and she's constantly bringing them so many toys and gifts in an attempt to make up for the fact that she's locking them away. But at the start of the book, she also says how she is going to secretary school. And she's like, oh, once I graduate secretary school, I'll be making, I'll have my own job and I'll have my own income and we can move out of here. She still wants to be approved of by her father and to be put back in the will, but she also has this other plan going on. However, we find out that she quits secretary school because, again, she's lazy and also has a hard time committing to things, and she's just so pampered and spoiled that she quickly stops going to secretary school. And this was not in any of the movies, but it was a detail I liked in the book. And Corinne was definitely one of the reasons why I kept reading this book and why I liked it. And just seeing her progression through the story as she shows her true colors, but also as she continues to be influenced more and more by her parents. And we see in both how at first, but especially in the book, how Corinne comes by very often and she's bringing them so many gifts. They are not short on games or toys or clothing and, the fanciest things. And she also sneaks them a Thanksgiving meal. And then on Christmas Day, she comes into the attic during the night and puts presents, so many presents, so that Corey and Carrie will wake up and think Santa has been there. And so she does do things to try to help make up for the fact that they are in the attic. And especially early on, it seems like she is, broken up about this and she is upset at what they are having to resort to, and yet she feels the ends justify the means. However, as time goes on, she of course starts to visit less and less and starts to care about them less and less. And also, I like the detail in the book, how she will refuse to look at Corey and Carrie as time goes on because their growth is drastically stunted and she doesn't want to actually look at them and acknowledge what is happening to them. And so she's also just in such denial. But over time, she does win back the affections of her father, and she is written back in the will. And so she comes up to tell them this, but she reveals, I'm back in the will, but he will never be okay with the fact that I had kids with your father. And so even though I'm in the will, you need to stay in here even longer and just wait till he dies. But she tells them he's super sick, so he's going to die any day. It won't be much longer. Just please hold on just a little bit more. But then Corinne has a long stint where she doesn't see them at all. And once she does show up again, she reveals that she has gotten married. But she and her husband are living with her parents. And so even though she is now married, she's not moving out. And so the kids still have to stay in the attic. But to move on to the ending, so in the book, around before the 3-year mark, Chris and Cathy are you know what? We need to take matters into our own hands. We need to just escape. And also, they are all getting kind of sickly, but especially the twins, right? Their growth has been so stunted and they are so negatively impacted by not getting the actual nutrients they need from being outside and everything. It's over the sake of the twins. They're we need to get out of here. And so Chris is we need money first. So they make a copy of the room key and he will sneak out multiple times over the course of months and steal change and small bills from his mother's extravagant room. And Cathy will go out as well sometimes and help him steal, but mostly it is Chris. And then they make a plan for the day they are going to leave. And they're okay, Chris will go out and he'll just steal a lot. He'll come back up, we will leave in the early morning hours, make it to the train station, and we will be on a train leaving by the time the grandmother comes in with our food in the morning. And so the night they are going to do this, Chris goes out. However, he is gone all night long. And so Cathy, when he returns, she's what the heck? We were supposed to be leaving this morning. You've been gone all night. What happened? And he also just looks very dejected. And he tells Cathy that their mother's room was empty. She and her husband have abandoned them without a word. And then he says that he was in other parts of the house and saw that the grandfather had already died. And he overhears a conversation between two servants and finds out that the father had died nearly a year ago. And he also learns that in the will, the grandfather said that Corinne gets everything, but if it is ever found out that she had children in her first marriage, or if she has children in her second marriage, she will lose it all. And he also finds out that they have been getting small doses of poison. And honestly, this detail in the will about the father, that just shows how cruel Corinne's father truly was. The fact that she can't even have kids with her new husband makes no sense and is so messed up, and it's just his way of still controlling her beyond the grave. And also, I think he probably knew about the kids she had with Chris. And so I feel again, this was his final way to get back at her, being yeah, you can have it all. But now, you're going to have to choose. Do you want it all or do you want your kids? And so obviously we see that Corinne had become so greedy and so heartless and turned off her emotions and became like her father, which again, maybe that was his ultimate goal too, was to make her as heartless and unfeeling as he was. And so, yeah, she resorts to micro-dosing them with arsenic, and that is why they have been so sickly. Also, I didn't even mention it, but Corey died. And so she made it seem like he had died from the flu because they take him to the hospital, when really it's because he had been getting arsenic in the powdered donuts. But after all of this is revealed, they still leave the house and they make it to the train station on time. And in the end, they are headed to a better future, but Cathy vows to one day see her mother again and get her vengeance, basically. And honestly, the ending felt very anticlimactic because, again, the book has so much drama going on that I expected a more dramatic ending. There's literally no final showdown between the grandmother or their mother. They just leave. That's it. Obviously, this is the first book in a series, so I'm sure there are a lot of dramatic moments as the books go on. But still, on one hand, they have the dead mouse and the powdered donut to prove that they'd been getting poisoned. but they opt to not go to the police. On one hand, if you view it as them being like, you know what, our mother has taken away enough of our lives, let's just let it go and move on, right? Let's just move on with our lives. However, they don't really let it go because Cathy, again, is holding on to the idea of vengeance. So just because she didn't turn her mother in now, she still hasn't let it go, But yeah, basically this whole book was so over the top that it felt weird that there wasn't a dramatic climax. Also, we get little details about the grandma, like, oh, she's claustrophobic. And I thought this would come into play later, but no, it never becomes relevant as far as this book is concerned. And there's other things too, where it's like, oh, we must be getting told this detail because it's going to come into play. And maybe it comes into play in later books, but as far as this one is concerned, it's like, okay, like, it seemed like a missed opportunity not to circle back to this and to have something happen with it. But the movie is a little bit different in this sense because, so again, they want to leave but need money. Corey dies, then they see their mom has left, and Chris overhears about the poison and all of that. But here we have some added drama because the grandmother comes in when they are getting ready to leave. And again, we find out she is claustrophobic. And so this does come into play, and they trap her in the stairwell in the dark where she is paralyzed with fear. And then there's more drama too because they had been starting to put a fence up, and so when they leave the house, they have the fence to contend with. However, one of the main butlers sees them, and Cathy tells him, like, we're Corinne's children, and the man is in shock and helps them get away. And then again, we see them on the train, and Cathy is vowing revenge. And so the movie ending is very overdramatic and silly in some ways, and yet I think it is very fitting for the story we have been being told, and so I didn't mind. And honestly, this isn't a good movie, but when you're adapting this source material, I kind of think it's impossible to make a good movie from this. And in order to make like a movie to be taken seriously that is actually effective, you would have to make some big changes to at least the tone, and you would have to almost just turn it into a horror movie or something. But the movie is literally a Lifetime movie. Lifetime adapted this, which is so fitting because the book has that Lifetime movie melodrama feel to it. But then to talk about the grandmother, so in the book, we learn that the reason the grandmother is claustrophobic is because her own mother would lock her in a closet when she misbehaved, which was reminding me of what Carrie's mom did to her in Carrie by Stephen King. But then the grandmother, she's also so obsessed with sexual sin, which was another thing that was reminding me of Carrie. And she will tell Chris and Cathy how like the male gender is born knowing more about this topic and, how gross it all is. And she seems to just kind of view any sort of sexual relations as a bad thing. And in the book, we hear how her husband, Corinne's father, he is also devoutly religious, just like the wife is. And also how, because he is so rich, he has donated so much money to their local church. And so he is seen almost like a god. And so he can do no wrong because he is so rich and has given so much money. And so I kind of think that one of the reasons the grandma is so fixated on sexual sin is because her husband is probably secretly a major pervert, but because he is, put on this pedestal by the town and everybody, she can't actually take her anger out on him, right? And so instead she takes her anger out on Corinne, and then later she takes her anger out on Corinne's children. And again, I think he was probably inappropriate in some way with Corinne, and the movie seems to imply this, but also her comment too about how like the male gender inherently knows things. It gave me the vibe that she herself was also mistreated by men, and that probably includes her own husband. But I would have loved to have learned more about her as well. And we see how she warns them against eating sweets, and she's like, no sugar whatsoever. And then when they start being poisoned, it is with donuts. And she has been telling them to avoid sweets. And so if they were listening to her and following the rules, they would not have eaten the donuts, which means they wouldn't have been poisoned. And so it's almost like she wasn't trying to help them. And yet, I don't know, like in the movie, she specifically tells them like, I wouldn't eat the donuts if I were you because sugar's bad. And so in the movie, she really does straight up say like, don't eat the donuts. And also in the book in 2014 movie, she gives them a pot of real flowers after hearing they have put up paper flowers in the attic, which seemed like a thoughtful gesture that is out of character for her. And in both, she also walks out when they try to give her a Christmas gift. But in the movie, They seem to play it as her maybe not wanting to get too close to them, and so she walks out. Whereas in the book, I had read this as more as her just being a jerk. But it's interesting watching this because even if the dialogue is the same, getting her performance and her visual, the way she says the lines and her facial expressions, I feel like it added another layer to her character and made her a bit more nuanced. And she's still a horrible person, of course, that was helping murder these kids and was abusive to them, and she is absolutely terrible. But yeah, I did think the movie added a bit more nuance. And she's played by Ellen Burstyn, who I was recently raving about in Requiem for a Dream. But now I want to move on to fairy tales because Cathy herself compares their situation to a fairy tale often. And just the way the book is written and the events going on mirror a fairy tale. Cathy is not only stunningly beautiful, she also has very long, beautiful hair. And in both, the grandma threatens to cut it off, but ultimately leaves it up to them to choose either her hair or they go without food for a week. And in the book, as they are debating what to do, I'm just like, cut your hair. You're talking about going without food for a week versus your hair. That's so stupid. Just cut it off. And so I sort of didn't understand the dilemma there. But ultimately, they choose not to cut her hair. But then in the night, the grandma puts tar in the hair. And at this point in the movie, they just cut her hair off. Whereas in the book, they spend all day long, Chris and Cathy, trying to get the tar out of her hair so that her hair can be saved. And they are successful to some extent. So in the book, they never do cut her hair. But again, I'm like, just cut your hair. Why? It just seems so silly. I mean, it's not like they have anything better to do with their time, right? So I guess it makes sense. They have the time to devote all day long getting tar out of her hair. But if you think of it as a fairy tale, I don't know, maybe there's power in her hair and what that symbolizes. And Cathy also has dreams, premonitions in the book too. And so that also adds to the fairy tale aspect. But by the way, in the book, after the grandma tars her hair, she also does not give them food for 10 days, so it goes even longer. They already did have some food, so they're able to stretch it, but ultimately they go 3 days without food, but they still have water from the tap. But we get a moment in the book and in the 80s movie when Chris cuts himself and has the twins drink his blood in order to keep them alive, which again was just so over the top. But yeah, throughout the book, Cathy is comparing their situation to a fairy tale. She is the princess who is locked away. The grandma is an evil witch. The grandfather is an ogre. Chris is her knight in shining armor, something she refers to him as on multiple occasions. And on one hand, I think this is a cool way to frame the book or to approach the book, is almost like it is a different kind of fairy tale, a more modern fairy tale. And yeah, so many things about this book I wish were executed better because this could have been a great idea. And yet the way she does it, again, I felt like the ridiculousness of it all kept me at arm's length, and I never actually felt as upset and disturbed as I should have with what happens. But to move on to the 80s movie. So honestly, this movie is pure camp, and it's so ridiculous, but very entertaining. And we get some comical moments that aren't meant to be funny, but they are, like when the grandmother picks up Carrie, who is screaming, which is a scene from the book as well. And then the ending with the mother falling was also hilarious. By the way, I just realized I've been comparing certain aspects of this book to Carrie, the Stephen King book, and she even has a character named Carrie. So I wonder if this was her nod to the fact that, this book is very different from Carrie, but maybe that's her nod to the fact that maybe she was inspired by that. But anyway, the 80s movie, they do make significant changes, including the fact that they get rid of the romance between Chris and Cathy. And apparently in the original version, they did have a sex scene. However, test audiences hated it. And so they removed that scene, but they still keep a lot of scenes that border on, showing what is going on with them. And here, once they are locked away, the grandmother, who is played by Louise Fletcher, she straight up tells them, your grandfather will never know about your existence. So right off the bat, you're just like, oh, so they just need to wait till he dies. And also in the movie, eventually Corinne stops showing up, but this wasn't a gradual thing, apparently. Also in the movie, they're only in the attic for a year, not 3 years. But yeah, Corinne stops showing up, and so they instantly are like, something must be wrong, we need to go save mom. And so that is why they leave the attic. But then when Corinne finds out that they left, she's really upset upset with them. Because of course nothing was wrong with her, she just wasn't going up to see them. And also here, they are served the donuts or the cookies, whatever they are, right from the start. So I don't know if it is implying that they were being poisoned right away, but here they are only locked up for a year. So she could have been trying to kill them right off the bat. But I prefer the book where we see her slow descent into greed and murder. But then to just jump to the end. So Chris leaves the room and discovers that their mom is getting married. And so they leave the attic and crash the wedding and reveal who they are. And at this point, they know their mom was poisoning them. And Cathy has saved a piece of the food and she shoves it at her mom, being like, eat the cookie. And this leads to a tussle outside and Corinne falls over the balcony and her dress gets caught in a way that leads to her being strangled. And they also had a thing with the grandma in the room where they attack her and leave her in the attic, but she is left alive. But yeah, from here, the three then walk off. And also in this version, the butler, John, he sees them when they first arrive. So he is aware that they exist, which was a huge change because in the book, the grandmother and Corinne were the only ones who were allowed to know. But in one of the other endings that were filmed, John the butler actually helps the kids and stands up to the grandmother. So this kind of, maybe this deleted scene or this alternate ending maybe is what inspired the 2014 movie to have him, help them get out of, with the fence being there. He's the one that helps them. So maybe that they were inspired by this 80s alternate ending. But apparently neither of the filmed endings are what the director wanted, but the producers thought that there needed to be more drama in the end, which I kind of agree with because the book felt anticlimactic. And so that is why they filmed the initial ending where they crashed the wedding, but Corinne lives. And also the father was still alive too, so he sees that Corinne was lying. So that ending was filmed, but then people didn't like it. So then they filmed this new ending where Corinne dies. But yeah, both endings, regardless, they're both very over the top and silly. I think I prefer the theatrical version just because the scene when Corinne dies is just like, I laughed out loud at that because it was just so ridiculous. And so again, this movie is very campy and silly and fun. And so I think that this ending just feeds into the campiness all the more. And I liked it. And this movie also, it has Corinne seemingly jealous of the attention Cathy got from her father, Corinne's husband. And then we see a similar scene where the grandmother is jealous of the attention Corinne is getting from her father. And so in this movie, you kind of see Corinne is having issues right off the bat, which again, in the book, it was so good to see her descent, whereas here we don't really see her progression. Also, this movie takes place in current day, which at the time was the 80s. Plus, Cathy and Chris are older than they had been in the book. And so those two things combined, where it's like, these are two teenagers and it's the 80s. Like they could escape and get out of there very early on, right? Like, and you also don't have Corinne being there telling them like, oh, just wait a little longer. Corinne isn't stringing them along. And so it almost seems weird that they don't just leave. Like this is the 80s. You could leave and make your own way in the world, right? Whereas in the book, the fact that it was the 50s and they were younger, and you had Corinne manipulating them and stringing them along. And initially, Corinne truly did believe they wouldn't be in there for very long. But it made sense in the book why they stayed for so long. And it took them forever before finally deciding to escape. It made sense. Whereas, yeah, in the 80s movie, it's like, what are they waiting for? But when it comes to book versus movies, so yeah, these movies are so bad and cheesy, and yet I found them so entertaining. And again, I think whether it was intentional or not, adapting these into campy, cheesy, bad, melodramatic movies is perfect given the source material. And when it comes to which one wins, it's hard to pick because I think they're all poorly done in their own way, and yet both of the movies are so entertaining. And the book, I don't think it's meant to be seen as campy or pulpy. Maybe it is, I don't know. But I think the book, it's almost like, I have such conflicted feelings because there's so much here where it almost has so much potential and almost could be an effective book that's disturbing. And yet, because she's a poor writer, she doesn't execute it very well. Whereas the movies are just straight up bad and campy and entertaining. And so, yeah, I feel like I haven't been the most eloquent in this video trying to formulate my thoughts. But in the end, I guess I will say that the book wins, which might be surprising given all of the issues I've been talking about that I have with the book. But it does convey the mother's denial better than the two movies, despite the 2014 movie doing a decent job with this. But another thing that is in the movie's favors is that they are pretty short, and it was good pacing. They didn't need to be long. Whereas the book feels so repetitive because it's like, we get it. You're locked in the attic and you hate it. You're being abused in various ways by your grandmother. You have sexual tension with your brother. Like, get on with the story. Stop telling us the same stuff over and over and over again. And so that's another way in which I didn't think the book was very well written, is I felt like it was just way too long. Same with the second book too. That one is crazy long. And again, there's just so much drama and ridiculousness in it. Honestly, I just don't think V.C. Andrews is a very good writer personally. And yet, having said all of that, I guess if I had to pick, I guess I would say that the book wins. I'm sure people would be like, well, duh, the book wins by a landslide. But I found the movies very entertaining. So that is why this is a tough one for me. But yeah, I would probably give all of them like 3 out of 5 stars. So they're all pretty equal for their own reasons. They all have pros and cons, to say the least. But anyway, I guess that wraps it up for Flowers in the Attic. Comment your thoughts down below and let's talk about it. You're welcome to think whatever you like. Obviously, I'm not here trying to convince you otherwise. If you loved this book, that's great. So yeah, anyway, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.